Hey, how's it going? So I promised Tommy and Ashley that it doesn't snow in Helena. And it's 70 degrees 12 months out of the year in Helena, right? So I don't know what this is either, Ashley. Like, I just have no idea what's happening right now. I've never seen it before. So we're in this, especially haven't seen 57 degrees yesterday and 30 degrees and snowing today. That's never happens. So we're in this series, and we have 2 weeks left here. And if you've not been with us, by way of quick review, we've been exploring this idea of, well, what do you do when you realize that what you believe is different than what you used to believe? And whether that means what you believe now is you no longer believe, or what that means is you believe differently than what you did 10 years ago. What we've been trying to do is put that on the table and deal with it in a way that had integrity and honesties to it so that we could continue to be people who are growing in the way we think about God and one another. What I want to do for these last 2 weeks is, for me, we're going to deal with a couple things that, frankly, as I've done my own work, and I hope that you're doing your own, like 10 years later, what matters work for you in your God construct. I want to deal with a couple things that, for me, it's like, okay, I don't want to lose that one. And quite frankly, this is one that I think is commonly lost, and I don't want to be among that group of people. And so what I want to do this morning is ask this question: what's the value of a question? Like, what value do questions bring to the table? When I was 17, I was towards the end of my senior year or my junior year of high school, rather, and my friends were all seniors and they were going to graduate, and so within that time frame, I was like, I think I need to find a girlfriend, which is somewhat like chauvinistic and using people. I get that. It's just where I was. But anyway, there was this need to transfer and shift emotionally and relationally, and I wasn't really interested in girls in high school because my friends and I just hung out together. But in this instance, there was this girl that I decided I was going to ask out, and I did. And of course, she said, sure, but of course, the one obstacle is dad, right? And not only is the obstacle dad, it's especially an obstacle when I realized that I was quite a bit older than her relative to being a 17-year-old junior in high school. And so I pulled up to her house in my Impala, which already was a problem because I had this giant muscle car. And I was smart enough not to honk. And I would like to give myself credit for that, but it's also because Hushka cars never have horns that work. It's just a part of the deal. We're easily overstimulated, so we just disconnect horns quite frequently. Or maybe it's that we have anger issues and we use them far too frequently. But anyway, I pulled up and I went to the door. And this was in Laurel, by the way. If you didn't know, I was raised in this town of about 10,000 people. And so in that kind of context, it's not that you know everybody, but of course everyone kind of knows of one another. And her dad was a railroader and my dad was a railroader. And so there was enough familiarity there that it was either going to work for you or against you, if you know what I mean. So I knock on the door and I got the dreaded, like, come in, which is like the worst way to enter, right? There's nobody there. They're just yelling at you to come in. And it was probably like a little sister or something. So I walk in. It was a split level home. I was on the main level where you have to choose, am I going down or am I going up? And Dad, his name was Mark, stuck his head around the corner from the basement. He's like, hey, Adam, come down here. So I didn't know it at the moment, but I was about to have the, like, let's clean the shotguns conversation. So I followed him into this basement room, and he's walking off into the corner, only it wasn't a gun case. He actually walked over to this upright piano, and he grabbed something off the top, and he started walking towards me. He's like, hey, so I don't know what you're doing tonight, which he didn't want an answer to that question, but he said, but if you'd like to go for a taco, I've got these coupons for free tacos to Taco John's, which is one of the fast food restaurants in Helena. Well, what I knew was, because my dad was coaching my stepbrother in baseball, was that the fine print of those coupons said that you had to be 14 years or younger, and I was 17, and this guy was a genius. Because I said, well, thank you for the offer, but actually I can't use those coupons. I tried, and they told me I couldn't. And he said, why? And I said, well, if you look at them, there's this fine print at the bottom, and it says must be 14 or under to use them. And he said, oh, well, Brittany's 14. How old are you? Whap, like just walked right into it. So there is a way of using questions, and maybe this is what gives us caution. Right, there's a way of using questions it's often not kind. Sometimes it's strategic. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it falls under passive-aggressive, but I'm not a clinician, so I can't even speak to when that's the case. But that's not the kind that I want to speak to. Now, I want to ask this question: what's the value of questions when the heart behind it is honest? When the heart is not judgmental and it's actually curious, when it's filled with wonder, whereas Lacey Borgo, one of my spiritual direction instructors, would say, where there's this concerted effort to stay small, to leave your authority at the door, Like to give somebody a gift. And yesterday not such a busy, fun day. I might not have forgot that I wanted to go to like the toy store downtown and get myself a gift wrapped and just carry it with me this whole time. Because I think there's a way that questions, they don't have agenda so much as they have invitation. And listen, I don't know what your God story is. I know we all have one, even if the story is you weren't raised in any kind of religious background. And I know that if I had your experience, I might better appreciate that it's a miracle you're even here, and that we all carry these different images of God with us. And here would be, like, if you're brand new to church or brand new back to church, which is probably more likely, or you're struggling with God in some ways, I guess this morning what I want to really get into is, what if this God asks questions? Because chances are the God that you were raised with, or the God that you've rejected, whether that was something you received in your 20s or when you were 4 years old, is a bony-fingered telling God. That's my friend Brian's phrase. I love that phrase. He's a telling God that is famous for his, and by the way, it's always a his, but he's famous for his bullet points and his facts and his commands and the things you ought to do and ought not to do and ought to know and ought not to say that you know. It's a very directing God. And certainly you can open the pages of the text and you can find and justify that God. But we live in the age of Jesus, post-Jesus. And I guess this morning what I want to explore for you, the conversation I want to spark for you, and you can take this where you please, obviously, is the good news is, no pun intended, that's not the way Jesus rolls. That you're far more likely to find him asking a question than you are giving a diatribe or a lecture or putting his bony fingers in the middle of your chest. And I guess my hope this morning is to invite you into a different consideration of a different image for God that we find in God becoming flesh in the man named Jesus, and that maybe we would just kind of look away from the other 62 books just for a moment and take a look at the Gospels and go, who is this God? And for those of you that this idea isn't a new one, and you already can kind of finish my sentences because you know this is a value that goes all the way back to some of our very first gatherings, this idea of both and questions, here would be my motive and my hope for you and for me and for us. This is easily lost. You know this because when you graduated as a nurse, there was lots of wonder. And if you're not careful, now there's just lots of knowing. Now, the opposite can be true as well, but it's harder to get there. You know this because you've had experience, and what you've seen is that if you're not careful, life has a way of hardening the edges, and you no longer think in terms of your questions, you think in terms of what you absolutely know. And I guess this morning, what I want to advocate is as we move into our next 10 years together, what would it be like to be a church who held on to a God who asks questions? Like one day, Jesus was walking through the city of Jerusalem, and he walked into this area that we would today refer to as the Pool of Siloam. They would have referred to it probably in their own day in that way. And you can actually go there today. It's among the holy places where Jesus was that you can visit if you want to. I've been there. But in this Pool of Siloam, which is kind of it's a room. It's not just out in the open. What happened there was that disabled people, that's where they hung out. And this is its own kind of commentary that I think is worth taking a little bit of a quick sidetrack, because remember, as Dr. Delmarter pointed out a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago, in the temple, disabled people weren't allowed to be there. If your legs didn't work or you were blind, that was in some sense a blight on God, and you weren't invited to come to the temple. Jesus shows up, and if you want to start talking about a faith that evolves, Jesus shows up, and it seemed like the first thing he does? He goes and starts hanging out with people with leprosy and people whose legs don't work. He goes to places like this, which is this kind of quarantined area where people who had these limitations just hung out, which is its own commentary that this Jesus is here to mess with the image of God, to evolve, I would say, the image of God that we carry. But what's even more fascinating to me, if not disturbing, is he walks into this area. And we don't know whether you counted the people in this area by the dozens or by the hundreds, but he walks into this area, and man, the most inconvenient thing has happened. I've got a hair in my mouth. Yeah, that's gross. The only thing worse than that would be if my fly was down, which I don't think it is. So Jesus walks into this area, and he, I just have to think that he's stepping over and around and through and on people, like, excuse me, pardon me, excuse me, oh, sorry, I stepped on your hand, but you can't feel it, excuse me, pardon me. Like, and he walks up to this one individual, and one of the questions is like, that's a little offensive, isn't it? One person, and he goes up to this individual, and guess what he says to this guy? This is, quite frankly, for me, one of the most important passages in all the Gospels. He just asks this question: do you want to get well? Which to me is interesting because he's God. Gods are famous for their answers, for their power, for what they know. And you have to ask the question, why would he ask a question? Of course he wants to get well. He's paralyzed. We don't know what he was. But of course, if we slow down, you go like, well, why would he ask a question? Well, ever had somebody pull you aside and start giving you advice that you never asked for? It's horrible. Maybe you can even look back on different seasons of your life where the advice being offered was advice you needed, but you still didn't want it. Or have you ever offered help to somebody, and it turns out you were right. They needed your help, but they didn't want your help? Ever wanted help? Ever wanted something for somebody more than they wanted it for themselves? That's brutal. I mean, it's part of why even the way we approach community the way we do around here, and we're going to talk about this next week, is my observation is that if we're not careful, we end up with an institution who cares more about your relational connectedness than you do, and it just doesn't work very well. Jesus says to this guy, do you want to get well? And I think if you think back to those moments where you weren't well, you get the brilliance of the question. But the point still stands. It was a question. It was an invitation. It was an opportunity. It wasn't a God who was bearing a pickaxe and a sledgehammer who was there to just do things against your will. This God is a self-limiting God, sometimes made no more apparent than when he leads with questions. What if this God leads with questions? What's the value of a question? You know, another ways we've tried to look at this series is this realization that sometimes your faith evolves because time moves, but sometimes it's not a time thing, it's a circumstances thing. Like you look back on that moment where the divorce wheels started to turn, and you realize that was a decisive moment in your God construct. Your view of God started to change. And it's not that God changed, it's that the perspective, it's like that God turned like 1/10 of 1 degree, and suddenly you could see God a little bit differently. Or you became a parent, or you lost a child, or you got a job, or you didn't get a job, or you graduated middle school into high school, or you're not a freshman anymore, you're a senior. Or you move from, like sometimes it's tied to circumstances, but I wonder if another way we can look at this, sometimes it's tied to questions. Like I'll bet you many of you have a story here. Like there was a point where someone asked you a question, whether it was a spouse or a stranger or a therapist, and it was a gift. They stayed small, they left their authority at the door, they just wondered about something. And you look back and go, man, that's the point where my faith pivoted yet again. You know, at the risk of using myself for the example, like I can see that in my own story, even from this last summer. Back in May, Dr. Bruner was here. Many of you will remember. He's a professor at Fox who's become a friend, and he teaches here once a year. He's coming back. I think it's in June he's coming this year. And this time he flew out he started his sabbatical, which is pretty flattering here in Helena. And in his case, he stays with us, stays in our basement, hangs out with our boys. I mean, he's become family over the years. And on Thursday, I think he flew in on a Monday. On Thursday, he and I went and hiked Mount Ascension with Dr. Oberweiser, and that was its own gift. And then when we got down off the mountain, appropriately, Jack's family was calling him for help, so Jack took off. And Dr. Bruner and I went to 10 Mile to have a beer. And we were sitting there. And at one point, I don't know where we were in the whole timeline, but at one point he looked across the table, and it was only 4 words, I think. It was, Adam, are you tired? It's not even a good question, right? Like we all know you're not supposed to ask yes or no questions. And I think, I call it, I had a hypochondriac response. Remember that? Like you get to work and you didn't think you were sick, but then your coworker's coughing and you're like, oh, I think I have a scratchy throat too. So I think like the one in me became very anxious, and so I started to like compensate and started to explain all the reasons why I don't think I am tired, and I kind of explained it away. And then later I was, for whatever reason, several weeks later was at a council meeting, and I told them that story, and we're like, Adam, you need to go back to him and figure out what in the world he saw. And that sparked a series of conversations that, if I'm being honest with you, my God image, I don't know, but I think at 50, I'm going to go, that was one of those decisive moments for me. Now, here's what I actually want to point out, lest I make it about myself, is like the guy was educated at Oxford. He has the socks to prove it. Did you know that? Oxford people wear socks. It's the creepiest thing. I think underwear too, but I've never seen those. Just kidding. I don't think it's associated with that. The guy has his PhD from Oxford. He's been teaching in one of the, in my opinion, one of the best seminaries in the country for several decades, as I recall. He himself has planted churches. He's got 20 years of local church experience. I don't know how many different students he's had. We spend a week together, and if you ask me what was the most meaningful part of having this very prestigious, powerful, intelligent, God-centered person in your house, I can boil it down to 4 words. And it really wasn't about the words so much as it was the crooked punctuation at the end of the sentence. Now, we can give one another complexes and make ourselves like kind of overcompensate by always trying to ask the brilliant questions. That wouldn't be my point of the story. My point would be, what's the value of a question? And do you always need answers? Or do you need sometimes you need somebody to provide, like, remember when you were a kid and you'd play with Hot Wheels and there was those ramp things, and then there's ramps that kind of get on-ramps. Like, sometimes we just need someone to give us an on-ramp. And oftentimes, it's a question that comes in a gift, and we can defer if we'd like. Like one day Jesus was, I don't know what he was doing, but someone came up to him and they asked him a question, and they said, "Teacher, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" Now, I love Tommy's song because it captures that eternal life, as we talk about, is it's not about where we go when we die, it's about who we are in the now and hoping that that goes on forever. But he asked him this question, and it's, I think, important to review or just talk real quickly about Jewish culture, because our culture centers around answers. But their culture, if you wanted to be in a rabbi's school, you would spend decades following a rabbi around, and you were ready when you demonstrated your knowledge through your questions. So it's a different world. In fact, a more contemporaneous rabbi has asked this question of, he's made the statement rather, he said, you Westerners, you think that the best way to get someone's understanding of a topic is to give them the questions and have them give you the answers. But in fact, if you really want to know the depth of someone's understanding, give them the answers and have them give you the questions. And you can see this going back to your profession. You can become rigid and hard, but there's also the type of nurse and the type of teacher and the type of real estate agent who, like 10 years later, you've got the questions. I mean, there's stuff you know, but there's these massive questions. Maybe you work in a social sector, and man, the world was so simple and laid out. If someone would just unleash you and your brilliance, you could solve all the problems. And now you're just like, man, I have a sense of the questions, but I don't have a sense of the answers. So we would say the answer is God is sovereign. They would say God is sovereign. Okay, what are the questions? Okay, well, what does that mean about this particular health issue that my child is dealing with? Did God arrange that? Or am I supposed to believe that he did that? What about the auto accident? Could God not have avoided that? What about prayer? Is that just a charade? Are those stories in the text not an example of times where this God kind of changes his mind? Well, what about Genesis, where it says this God grieved the situation and kind of had to take a deep breath and come up with plan B? What about a self-limiting Jesus? Like, did he know that this guy wanted to get well and he was like doing this Obi-Wan Kenobi thing? Or was there some context there? Was it a genuine question? So this guy says to Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He's doing it the way the Jewish people did it. And Jesus says, well, what does your law say? Like, how do you read it? In other words, there's 613 Old Testament commands. We all have to arrange them in a certain order. Like, you can't just put them flat. How do you put them in order? Now, part of what Jesus did here is he didn't assume. Part of what I'm learning about questions, which I'm horrible at, is the importance of not assuming. Like, if you were to say to my wife, my favorite color is blue, she would go, what hue of blue? Like, where do you find that blue from? And she would dig in deeper. I think it might be a nursing thing. I'm not sure. Sure, I would just go like, oh yeah, blue. And I would just assume that your color blue and my color blue are the same thing. And so now I can talk about myself again. But what Jesus did here is he avoided the assumption. Spiritual direction is this thing that I've been practicing and learning academically here for a couple years. We did a whole series on it called Listening Therapy. I haven't shaved since then. I was so inspired by Roy and James in that video. But really what spiritual direction is it's allowing that we need therapists. We need interventionists who at times tell us what to do. It's allowing that we need teachers who at times just pump information at us, whether we're asking for it or not. And sometimes what we need is someone to listen. And the win of spiritual direction is you know that there's a calendar, there's a spot on your calendar sometime in November where you're going to spend an hour talking to somebody about how you experienced God this month, which in a sense, it's kind of like having a marriage thing on the calendar, like, oh, I better be able to talk about something about my marriage. It's the same idea. But spiritual direction, the idea is you're going to show up and you're going to talk about that. And an expert spiritual director, which I am not, what makes them so skilled is their ability to use your words to pave on-ramps for you, to explore certain things that maybe you're just blowing past, to stay small, to not assume. So when you say, I was angry, a really good one would say, what do you mean by anger? Like what were you experiencing there? It's really intimidating. I'm terrible at it. I love it because I love listening to people talk about God. I hate it because there's this pressure of like, okay, now's the part where you ask the brilliant question, and I don't ever have the brilliant question. So I was talking with my instructor about this last week before last, rather, and she said, Adam, here's the key. You don't have to have the brilliant question. So if I could speak out of both sides of my mouth a little bit. Sometimes she said, what's just as effective as a question is just the phrase, I wonder. Take the intuition, take the thought, and just say, I wonder what you mean by being angry. I wonder if anger is a theme in your life. I'm not talking about myself at all. Like, I wonder. And then she said, but the key is you have to stay small. I loved her phrase. She said, assumptions sabotage conversation all the time. Jesus does that. What do you mean? What's written in your law? And the guy says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. To which I think Jesus just mic drops. There's just like, bravo. You're plagiarizing my sermon from yesterday, but bravo. But then the guy demonstrates that he's actually trying to one-up Jesus. Because if you can ask the question, if you get the last question in, like you win the volley. And he says to Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus, when not asking a question, tends to tell a story. And so he tells a story that's among the most iconic in our culture. He tells a story about a guy who was beaten and left for dead on a particular road between Jerusalem and Jericho, which is somewhere around 14 or 15 miles, and it's a pass. We would call it a mountain pass. It's a pretty aggressive move from Jerusalem up high down to Jericho. And at the time, it was a very narrow, treacherous path. Well, this guy was left for dead, and who happens upon him first, Jesus says, was a priest. Now, Jesus is playing games. Remember, Jesus has got these issues with temple spirituality. And so the deal with the priest is if the priest stops and helps the guy, then the priest is defiled religiously and he can't do his job tomorrow. So Jesus says the priest goes around him. And then along comes a Levite, another priest guy. And Jesus says he too, recognizing that he couldn't go to work tomorrow, goes around him. And then along comes, and in Jesus' context, this was like the worst of the worst of the worst. I mean, along comes a guy wearing a Make America Great hat again. Or along comes a woman wearing a Bernie Sanders t-shirt. It's all relative to you. Along comes a Muslim. Along comes an atheist. Along comes that teacher who mistreated your child. Along comes the worst of the worst. And Jesus essentially goes, that person who you hate the most actually tended to that person, took great care of him, took him into town, provided financially for his needs. And then Jesus, he's so stinking awesome. He tells this story. This guy has him trapped. Jesus tells a story. And then he says, well, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? I mean, it's just like they're just playing karate, only they're not using swords or anything. They're just, what's the value of a question? How have you experienced that in your own life? I sometimes wonder if our greatest regrets aren't going to be around the bucket list things that we didn't accomplish, but the questions that, upon reflection, we failed to ask. You know, not because we were too afraid to ask them, because we were too preoccupied, too self-centered, too locked in. I can already see this within my own kids. Like there's this, the time is short. And there's this like, I didn't ask the question because they're talking about something that I have no interest in, and it's 8:15 and I'm tired and ready for bed. And rather than ask the question, you just kind of pretend like you're listening. Or your spouse comes home for work and you didn't ask the question. You turn on the TV, you stare at the phone. I wonder if our regrets, especially when relationships come to an end, are going to be around the questions, the assumptions we made and the questions we didn't ask. Because we weren't wondering enough, we weren't curious enough, we didn't suspend what we know. I'm constantly trying to remind myself, and I fail at it all the time in meetings. Like, Adam, you already know what you know. Go into this meeting trying to figure out what you don't know. Questions we didn't ask because we weren't present, because we weren't curious. And then sometimes, and I guess that's my point this morning, we slow down and we recognize that the greatest gifts the greatest gifts we've ever received were people who gave us questions. Like I had this friend, Greg Cherick, 20 years ago when we started a youth ministry, and there's many people in this room who were a part of that. There was this 35-year-old guy named Greg who volunteered to help start it. He was brand new to following Jesus, and he knew that the best way to get well is to help someone else get well, and so he wanted to jump into this thing. And he and his wife, in hindsight, he was an accomplished businessman. She was is an accomplished scientist. They had two, I'm guessing the littlest one was just brand new newborn, and probably like an 18-month-old or something. I'm using past tense because Greg was coaching first base a handful of years ago at his son's baseball game and had this undetected heart condition and died of a heart attack while coaching first base. But Greg was this remarkable person who, in hindsight, I was a 21-year-old know-it-all, Enneagram 1, type A control freak who was starting a youth ministry. And Greg just came alongside with a towel over his arm and was the first one to leave and the first one to get there and the last one to leave, and just helped. But to me, the legacy of Greg and the example of this questions is this. You know, life drifts and you lose contact with relationships. And I've had people say to me, I'm bad at distant relationships. I'll be bad at this one too. And I respect that. But as our life drifted, and eventually I drifted into Helena, it's of no credit to mine that Greg and I stayed in contact. In fact, a week before he died, ironically, he called me and we talked about a friend who had just died of a brain aneurysm. So if you're an Enneagram 6, like your heart rate's going up right now. Anyway, sorry for insider language, but if you're an anxious person, sorry for all those like catastrophic stories. But here's what Greg did. He had a Palm Pilot. Remember those? And he had a half an hour in his every week. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but he had a half an hour blocked every week. And then he had a list in the notes of the Palm Pilot. Like this was before phones did things other than Snapchat. And when that half hour came up every week, he would pull up his list, and he had 10 or 20 people on the list, and they were people who he lost contact with, people like me. And so if my name was at the top of the list, he would call. And if I didn't answer, he would leave a very thoughtful voicemail. And then he would move me to the bottom of the list, and he would call the next person. And if they didn't answer, he'd leave them a very thoughtful voicemail, and he'd put them to the bottom of the list. And if the next person answered, turns out he had about 27 minutes to talk. And when he was done with that conversation, he'd move him to the bottom of the list, and next week he'd call the next person at the top. So about every 3 months, long after I stopped doing youth ministry with Greg, and I only found out that he did this years later, I got this call from Greg, and I often wasn't able to answer it. And guess how the conversation would go? It wasn't, hey, Adam, it's been a while. Did you know Connor is like one of the best baseball players in Billings, which I later figured out he was? Hey, did you know that I had this little girl who actually has some they had this kind of surprise baby who had some pretty serious health conditions? Did you know? That's not the way it sounded. The way it sounded was, hey, Adam, how's it going? How's Teresa? How are the boys? How old are they now? How's Narrate? How's it going up in Helena? A person who, in my mind, embodies what it means to live with a disposition that just wants to take interest in others, who knows that sometimes the best gift we can give is the gift of our interest, of our presence, of our awareness. And I think when we ask this question of what's the value of the question, it's good to remind ourselves that we are, and you may or may not identify as a Christian, and that's okay if you don't, but many of us were a part of this historic tradition, and I'm proud to be a part of it. And this tradition is, this Christian tradition of believing that the tomb was empty, it's often founded upon the things that we believe. We have our creeds and our doctrinal statements, and when we're looking for a church, we want to know what are the bullet points and do they say what I want them to say? And I'm not saying that's not important. The Trinity, the divinity of Christ, the authority of Scripture, yes, yes, yes. But here to me is the irony. We're famous for what we know. We follow a rabbi who's famous for what he asked. You can have deep theological debate about whether or not Jesus even claimed to be God, which I certainly believe he did, but the reason there's even room for that debate is because there's not 4 pages or 4 chapters in the Gospel of Mark where he gives this long lecture. He got into that conversation by saying, well, who do you say that I am, Peter? He had some profound convictions about the world being a perfectly safe place for us to be. But rather than lecture on it, he just said, well, who of you by worrying could add a single hour to your life? Before his death, he went before Pilate. And if ever there was a time to do a mic drop and just show up Pilate and just let the world know once and for all who you are, it was then. And he just said, well, what is truth? Listen, we're a part of a community, in my estimation, with a lot of really great churches. Catholic and Protestant, and here to me is why I love that. To me, that gives us permission to be nuanced. It gives us permission to have our own bias and bent. I absolutely believe that what we believe is important, but what would it be like if God was better represented as a God of questions? Not in an elusive, evasive kind of way, but in a humble, gracious, kind of way. Alan Hirsch, I had him as a professor in grad school, he said, I don't remember anything he said in that class save this one thing: mystery without study is worthless. Mystery after study is priceless. What would it be like to be a part of a faith that studied and knew and had conviction, but also held tightly to this idea that we follow rabbi who asks questions? And what would it be like to be a part of a community who listen, all church plants ask questions. It's the MO. But can a church possibly exist for decades, have deep conviction, real faith, and also be known for the humility of its questions? That we don't come with crowbars and pickaxes. We come with a genuine desire to stay curious and ask questions and not live from a place of insecurity. What would it be like for you as a parent, as a spouse, as a leader, if you did the hard work of remembering the questions? I'd like to pray, and we're going to sing one more song. God, this is among those things that's so easy to talk about and so hard to live out. I would guess there's not a person here who's going, oh, that's bull. And yet, God, it's hard. It's hard because life is busy. It's hard because distractions are everywhere. It's hard because we become anxious, and suddenly it's about keeping things safe. So God, would you make us a people who are genuine in our curiosity? Not in a manipulative kind of there's a guillotine at the end of this road, but just in a genuine, I wonder if kind of way. And God, as we explore you and latch on to you and develop an image for you that carries us through life, would you keep us gracious and humble in that?
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.